She walked into the bank with quiet confidence and a check worth $250,000. Minutes later, the CEO called the FBI suspecting fraud. But when agents arrived, they didn't arrest her. They stood at attention and called her ma'am. Who is Naomi Ellis? And why did this one moment bring an entire institution to its knees? Watch until the end. You won't believe what she does next. Dear viewer, what you are about to witness is not just a story, it is a powerful testament to the quiet power and pursuit of justice in places most people ignore. If this is your first time here, I warmly invite you to share where you are watching in the comments below. And if stories like this move you, challenge you, or make you think, consider subscribing and clicking the bell icon. We share voices that deserve to be heard every day. Thank you for being here. Now let's get into the story. The marble lobby of Hamilton and Crest Financial in downtown Boston didn't just glisten, it gleamed with the kind of quiet arrogance that came from decades of handling money that could buy and sell cities. The air smelled of polished wood leather and old power. It was the kind of place where voices stayed low, shoes clicked with purpose, and strangers were silently ranked by the cut of their suits or the brand of their watches. But on that morning, as sunlight slanted through the floor-to-ceiling windows, someone walked in who didn't fit that script. Not in the way they expected. Naomi Ellis stepped through the rotating doors like she owned them, and maybe in a sense she did. She wasn't flashy. No glitzy jewelry, no personal assistant tailing her no loud declarations. Just a woman in a tailored navy coat, her expression unreadable, her gait steady, and in her hand a check for $250 few $250. At the front desk, a young receptionist glanced up, blinked, and immediately straightened her posture. "Good morning," Naomi said. Her voice was low, smooth, authoritative, not commanding attention, but refusing to be ignored. "I'd like to speak with a manager. I need to deposit this into my business account." She held up the check briefly, just long enough for the receptionist's eyes to widen before sliding it back into her folder. "Certainly," the woman replied, then buzzed upstairs. What followed next happened fast, but not so fast that it couldn't be dissected later over dinner conversations, news segments, and protest speeches. From the executive suite above, Gregory Vaughn descended. Vaughn was the kind of man who always entered a room like it owed him something. CEO of the Hamilton and Crest Boston branch, for nearly a decade he was known for his discerning eye, his sharp suits, and his ability to smell risk from a mile away. That morning he didn't like what he smelled. He shook Naomi's hand with a forced smile, glanced at the check, then at her face, and asked, "And where exactly did this check come from?" Naomi's lips curved just slightly, not enough to be a smile, more like a mark of recognition. She'd seen this dance before. "It's from a verified client. You'll find all the documentation in order." Vaughn didn't take the folder she offered. He nodded to a teller instead. "Chelsea, could you begin verification, please?" And Naomi was it. "Could you take a seat? This may take a while." She didn't sit. The room was quiet, too quiet. A few other customers glanced up from their phones, sensing something off, but unsure what. Naomi remained standing, her eyes never leaving Vaughn. She knew what he was doing. She had been here before, in different forms. Suspicion disguised as protocol. Profiling dressed up in policy. 10 minutes later, Vaughn reappeared. His expression was different, now tenser. There was no smile. "I've contacted the issuing bank," he said, and I've also placed a precautionary call to the FBI. Naomi blinked once slowly. You called the FBI, she asked, her voice even. She didn't raise her tone. She didn't step back. Given the amount and the irregularities, Vaughn said, I think it's best to proceed carefully. I see, Naomi replied. In the silence that followed, something in the air shifted. A teller dropped her pen. A security guard near the entrance adjusted his stance. No one said it out loud, but everyone knew what was happening. It wasn't about a check. It was about perception. The black woman, with the composure of a diplomat, the quiet confidence of a surgeon, the calm that unsettled men like Vaughn, she didn't look like someone they expected to see walking into this institution with that kind of money. That was the real irregularity. 20 minutes passed. Then the glass doors opened again. Two men entered, tall, suited, and unmistakably government. They moved with the precision of people used to being watched. The older of the two scanned the room, then walked directly toward Naomi, and then everything stopped. Deputy Director Ellis, the agent, said, his voice cutting clean through the air. We weren't aware you were conducting field work this morning. The silence that followed was deafening. Chelsea, the teller, looked from Naomi to Vaughn, her face pale. Gregory Vaughn blinked, stepped back. Deputy Director, he asked, but the question died before it finished forming. The younger agent nodded at Naomi. We received a call about suspected fraud. We didn't expect the source to be our own liaison. Naomi finally turned to Vaughn. This is what proceeding carefully looks like to you. He didn't answer. Couldn't. The agent picked up the check, flipped it once, then looked at Vaughn. It's legitimate, he said, backed by one of our verified contractors. And so is she. Very legitimate. Naomi didn't move. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. I think she said quietly, this conversation is over. She reached for the check and placed it back into her folder. I'll be transferring all accounts associated with my firm out of this bank, she added, effective immediately. Vaughn opened his mouth to protest, but the agent cut in. We'll make a note in our report. Naomi turned without another word. As she walked toward the door, her heels echoed once again in the silent marble lobby. But this time, it wasn't the sound of a stranger. It was the sound of someone who had made her point without ever needing to raise her voice. As she left Maya, the young intern standing near the reception desk whispered under her breath. They had no idea who they were messing with. And just like that, the moment passed. But for Hamilton and Crest, and for everyone who had seen what happened, it would not be forgotten. Because Naomi Ellis had walked in expecting to be seen as a professional. They had chosen to see her as a problem. And that mistake was about to change everything. It started with a call meant to exert control, but it ended up doing the opposite. By the time Agent Cole and Agent Ramirez left Hamilton, and Crest Financial whispers had already begun circulating through the lobby, the moment they addressed Naomi Ellis as Deputy Director, everything in that room cracked the air of quiet superiority, the polished confidence of Gregory Vaughn, the illusion of professionalism. It all fractured into something undeniable. The receptionist, Maya, stood behind the counter stunned. She'd watched the entire exchange unfold, the arrogant skepticism, the veiled condescension, the sharp pivot, when authority revealed itself not in the form of a white male CEO, but in a poised black woman with the weight of a federal title. She didn't know Naomi personally, but in that moment, she knew she'd never forget her. But Gregory Vaughn, he wasn't stunned. He was unraveling. In his office upstairs, he sat at his desk, staring at the blinking cursor on a blank email screen. His assistant, Julia, had already forwarded him the news, a quick online headline posted by an independent reporter who'd somehow caught wind of the situation within the hour. The article wasn't bombastic. It didn't need to be. It simply stated the facts. Deputy Director of Federal Operations misidentified as fraud suspect at major Boston bank, accompanied by a still image from a witness's phone showing Naomi Ellis being saluted by federal agents in the very lobby where Vaughn had stood questioning her integrity. That image would go viral within the next 24 hours. But before the internet would get its hands on it, something else happened, something more immediate. The call Gregory had made to the FBI thinking he was protecting the reputation of his bank was now on record as a false flag initiated without just cause. It triggered an internal flag at the Bureau, prompting an ethics review of the incident. What had been a reflexive act of prejudice, masked as due diligence, had now turned into a liability. By mid-afternoon, Vaughn received a call, not from the press, not from the police, but from a regional director at corporate headquarters. Greg, the voice on the other end said, icy and deliberate. Did you really call federal authorities on one of their own deputy directors? It wasn't personal, Vaughn stammered. The check there were irregularities. She didn't offer credentials until she didn't have to. Greg, the voice snapped. She was making a deposit, not a withdrawal, not a suspicious transaction, not cash. A paper trail so clean it practically glowed. There was a long pause. Vaughn swallowed. This isn't just about bad optics. This is about liability. This is about exposure. Vaughn knew then he had not only misjudged a woman, he had underestimated a system that would not shield him from the consequences. But while Hamilton and Crest scrambled internally, the real consequence was playing out in the world beyond their glass walls. By 4 p.m., Naomi Ellis's name was trending, not because she'd issued a statement, but because people who recognized her began speaking out, quietly at first, then loudly. Former colleagues, community leaders, legal scholars, and even policy advocates posted about her track record, a 15-year veteran of federal law enforcement, currently overseeing civilian engagement initiatives, and an architect of one of the Bureau's most progressive outreach reforms. She wasn't just respected, she was revered. And the moment people saw the photo, her standing tall as the agents addressed her by title, they felt something deeper than admiration. They felt vindicated. How many times had they been misjudged, dismissed, interrogated for daring to occupy space they were told implicitly or otherwise wasn't theirs? Naomi had said nothing, not yet, and that silence only amplified her impact. Meanwhile, back at the bank, the tension was impossible to ignore. Maya watched as Chelsea the teller, who had first handled Naomi's transaction, returned from a break with red-rimmed eyes. She sat down, hands shaking slightly, as she resumed her post. She didn't speak for a while, but eventually she turned to Maya. I knew something was wrong, she whispered, when Mr. Vaughn told me to delay processing the check. I should have said something. You couldn't have known, Maya replied softly. But I did, Chelsea said, her voice cracking. Not because of who she was, but because of how calm she stayed. Like she'd seen it all before and was already past being hurt. That night, Chelsea went home and wrote her resignation letter. Elsewhere, Naomi Ellis sat alone in her home office, the city skyline glowing faintly behind her. Her phone had been buzzing nonstop. Journalists, colleagues, even officials from the Justice Department. She hadn't answered. Not yet. She stared at the check, now resting on her desk. The same check that had been treated like contraband by men who couldn't fathom that someone like her didn't just belong in the room, she could own the room. She thought about calling someone, her sister maybe, or her friend in D.C. But she didn't. Instead, she opened her laptop and began typing. Not a statement, not a press release, just thoughts measured, sharp, and deliberate. Words she wasn't sure she'd share. Yet. But even in that moment of privacy, Naomi understood something with startling clarity. Gregory Vaughn had tried to reduce her to a threat. Not because she'd done anything wrong, but because he'd seen power in a package he didn't respect. And now that decision would follow him. The call he made had set in motion more than just protocol. It had triggered a cultural reckoning. In boardrooms, people whispered her name. In living rooms, families replayed the video frame by frame, explaining to their children what it meant to be profiled, what it meant to hold your ground. And in offices like hers across the country, women like Naomi felt seen not because they had sought recognition, but because they had refused to shrink. The consequence of that call was no longer about Vaughn's mistake. It was about what Naomi Ellis represented. And the truth was becoming louder than any apology. The next morning, Gregory Vaughn didn't bother with his usual routine. The espresso sat cold on the counter. His neatly pressed suit hung untouched in the closet. He stood by the window of his penthouse condo, staring at the skyline of downtown Boston. But his eyes weren't focused on the buildings. They were focused inward. The previous day had unraveled everything. What began as a routine escalation, what he'd arrogantly assumed was a moment of professionalism, was now spiraling beyond his grasp. He had made a call to the FBI under the pretense of policy claiming he was just being cautious. But what he hadn't realized was that the woman he tried to scrutinize held more clearance, more credibility, and more integrity than he ever had in his 30-year banking career. Gregory replayed it all in his mind. The stiffness in Naomi Ellis's posture, the power in her stillness, the authority in her silence. She hadn't needed to yell. She hadn't needed to justify. And yet her mere presence had thrown his assumptions into chaos. The news cycle hadn't slowed. Overnight, Naomi's name had surfaced across national headlines. Profiling at prestigious bank sparks outrage. Federal deputy director targeted in Boston bank incident. Some reports didn't name Vaughn outright, but the institution he led, Hamilton and Crest, was now under national scrutiny. Calls were flooding in. Board members, donors, media liaisons, clients. The phrase, "we need to talk," had never carried so much weight. But what unsettled Gregory more than the press was the silence from within his own walls. No one defended him. No one made excuses. Because no one could. The weight of realization wasn't just about what he had done, it was about what he had revealed. In that one moment of doubt in the decision to second-guess a black woman depositing a legitimate check, he hadn't just embarrassed himself. He had exposed a system that, for all its wealth and polish, was still operating on suspicion, fear, and a hierarchy built on appearances. Meanwhile, Naomi sat in her office in the federal building, reviewing documents she could barely concentrate on. The walls around her were lined with commendations. Awards framed photos from collaborative task forces across the country. But none of that mattered to her now. What weighed on her wasn't the public spectacle. It was the familiarity of it all. This wasn't the first time she had been misjudged. It wasn't the first time she had seen doubt flicker in someone's eyes before they'd even asked her name. It wasn't the first time her calm confidence had been interpreted as arrogance, her silence mistaken for submission. But what made this time different wasn't the bank. It was the moment those two agents walked in and saluted her without hesitation. In that instant, everything Vaughn had projected onto her, every ounce of doubt, suspicion, condescension was shattered. And not just for her, but for everyone watching. She thought of Chelsea, the young teller, whose hands had trembled. Of Maya, whose eyes had widened with something like guilt. Of the security guard, who hadn't moved, but had clearly understood something monumental had just occurred. And Naomi couldn't stop wondering how many people had walked out of that bank feeling smaller than when they walked in. She knew what Vaughn had done wasn't about her personally. It was about a system of perception, one that punished unfamiliarity with resistance and disguised prejudice as procedure. But she also knew the power of a single moment. And this one had cracked open something deeper. Across Boston, discussions had ignited. At schools, in office break rooms, at kitchen tables. Black professionals told stories they had buried for years. Students asked their teachers questions about equity and respect. Bank clients closed accounts quietly, not out of vengeance, but out of conscience. And in the midst of it all, Naomi remained still. She wasn't chasing retribution. She wasn't crafting a viral response. She was waiting for something more meaningful than outrage, for something more lasting than applause. Gregory Vaughn, meanwhile, was beginning to understand the cost of his decision, not just in public opinion, but in moral currency. He had treated professionalism like a performance, thinking it was something you wore like a suit. But Naomi Ellis had shown him that real power didn't demand recognition. It revealed itself when others tried to deny it. He sat at his desk and picked up the phone. Not to call the press, not to issue a statement, but to call his daughter. She was in college studying public policy. They hadn't spoken much recently, but today he felt the need to say something different. Dad, her voice came through the line. I messed up, he said, the words sticking in his throat. There was silence. I want you to be proud of me, he added, but I need to earn that again. Another pause. Then you still can. And in that moment, Gregory Vaughn understood what Naomi Ellis had always known, that realization wasn't about guilt. It was about reckoning. And reckoning only mattered if it led to change. When the dust began to settle, it wasn't declarations or apologies that sparked real change. It was what came next, in the quiet moments when institutions had to look in the mirror and decide what they would do with what they saw. For Hamilton and Crest, and for Gregory Vaughn, the reckoning had already begun. But for Naomi Ellis, the path forward wasn't about humiliation. It was about transformation. Naomi declined every interview. She turned down network requests, editorials, and even a proposed magazine cover. She wasn't interested in becoming a symbol or a sensation. She wanted structure. She wanted systems to hold weight, not just names. And so she started where power was most often abused: policy. With her influence inside the bureau and growing respect from leaders in the financial sector, Naomi convened a roundtable that would not be televised, not be branded, and not be performative. It included federal regulators, diversity and ethics officers from major banks, civil rights attorneys, and community leaders. Not once did she raise her voice. Not once did she point fingers, but she asked one question that stayed in the room like a heartbeat. What does accountability look like when no one's watching? She didn't want apologies. She wanted protocols. She didn't want promises. She wanted process. Within weeks, Hamilton and Crest initiated a series of reforms, real ones, not just sensitivity training or public statements crafted by PR teams. They brought in independent auditors to assess customer service interactions across branches, specifically those involving large sum transactions and non-white clients. They overhauled their internal escalation procedures, mandating that no call to law enforcement could be made without supervisor oversight and a documented cause beyond suspicion. But Naomi's reform didn't stop at one bank. Using her authority, she worked with the Bureau to create a pilot initiative, the Financial Dignity Compliance Program. It was designed to review the behavioral protocols of banking institutions receiving federal protection and oversight. The initiative introduced two mandatory components: anti-bias architecture training for executive leadership, and a community liaison board comprised of citizens who had experienced discrimination while engaging in financial transactions. This wasn't about shaming, it was about correcting. Meanwhile, Naomi's team began working quietly with local universities to build civic education modules that demystified the financial and legal systems for young people, especially those from historically marginalized communities. The goal was simple: empower people to understand not just their rights, but the structure that governed them. She wasn't alone in the work. Chelsea, the young teller who had hesitated that day, left Hamilton and Crest not in disgrace, but with a renewed sense of responsibility. She joined a nonprofit aimed at fostering workplace equity and later became one of the youngest members of the Community Advisory Board created through Naomi's initiative. Her voice, once uncertain, now carried weight. And when she spoke to interns or young professionals, she told them, doing nothing is still a decision. Choose better. Even Gregory Vaughn, though no longer the face of Hamilton and Crest, made quiet contributions. In an act of rare humility, he requested to sit in on the new employee onboarding program, not to lead it, but to listen. The first time he heard a facilitator explain how unconscious bias could cost someone their dignity, he didn't defend or debate. He just nodded, and for the first time in his career, took notes with the intent to learn rather than lead. The city of Boston, too, began to notice the shift. What had begun as a moment of humiliation had grown into a model. Other banks watching the fallout implemented similar programs. A national summit was proposed on equitable treatment in financial institutions, and Naomi again declined the keynote. Instead, she recommended Maya, another young woman present that day, to speak about psychological safety and leadership. When asked why she never used her story for personal elevation, Naomi simply replied, "Because justice that centers on one person can be undone. But justice built into a system can survive us all." Change wasn't loud. It wasn't always fast, but it was real. And through every spreadsheet, updated every new hire, trained every policy reworded, Naomi Ellis wasn't seeking redemption for a moment that never should have happened. She was building something no one could deny. Not fear, not assumptions, not even silence. Naomi Ellis never set out to become a figurehead, yet that's what happened. Her legacy wasn't etched in headlines or parades of praise. It lived in the shifts she sparked in institutions, in people, in the quiet places where change often begins and takes root without applause. Months after the incident, at Hamilton and Crest, Naomi returned to the very place that tried to cast her as a threat, not for vindication, for impact. The bank had partnered with the Bureau and local nonprofits to launch an initiative inspired by her work, the Ellis Equity Standard. It was more than a name, it was a practice one that would be monitored, measured, and shared across banking systems nationwide. She walked through those same glass doors, past a new mural painted in the lobby, a swirl of interwoven hands holding scales flanked by a quote from Naomi's own writing. Assumption is the thief of dignity. Recognition is the start of repair. It wasn't self-congratulatory, it was instructional. Inside a group of new recruits waited, diverse in age, race, gender, and lived experience. They weren't just there to count money or open accounts, they were being trained as the next generation of ethical financial stewards. Naomi didn't lecture. She sat in a circle with them and asked a simple question. When was the last time you felt unseen? What followed was not silence, but story. They spoke of immigrant parents and invisible ceilings, of being doubted because of names or accents, of wondering if success could coexist with authenticity. Naomi listened, not to correct, but to understand. Later that day, she met with youth from the Open Doors Fellowship, a mentorship pipeline she quietly co-founded. Designed to place underrepresented high school students in summer immersion programs at law firms, banks, and city government, it had expanded far beyond Boston. Her vision wasn't just about diversifying professional spaces. It was about preparing young people to navigate systems with both courage and comprehension. One of the students, a 17-year-old named Darren, told her, "I used to think power was something you had to earn by being quiet. But you taught us that sometimes power begins the moment you stop shrinking." Naomi smiled, but she said nothing. Darren's words didn't require embellishment. They were a reflection of something she hoped would outlive her position clarity. Elsewhere, the effects of her work rippled. Banking networks across the country reached out for consultation. Some wanted to implement the Ellis Equity Standard. Others asked her to audit their internal compliance cultures. Naomi only accepted those who agreed to one condition: change must be community informed. She insisted on including voices that banks typically ignored: single mothers, formerly incarcerated citizens, undocumented workers. Not because they were victims, but because they were stakeholders. The FBI, too, restructured its community engagement protocols. Naomi's department led a new unit focused solely on the intersection of public trust and federal presence in private sector disputes. What once had been a one-time embarrassment now served as a blueprint for conflict resolution, grounded in truth and restoration. Despite all of this, Naomi never claimed center stage. She mentored quietly. She advised with clarity. She deflected praise with grace. Her colleagues called her the compass, not because she pointed to herself, but because she always redirected attention to what truly mattered. One evening, during a candlelit panel discussion on leadership and equity, Naomi was asked what success now meant to her. She paused before answering. "Success isn't arriving," she said softly. "It's returning. Returning to spaces that once rejected you, not to seek validation, but to make them better than they were when you left." That night, her words echoed in the minds of everyone in the room. Not as a soundbite, but as a mandate. Naomi Ellis didn't create a moment. She launched a movement. One built on stillness, as strength truth, as tool, and justice as a living, breathing pursuit, not locked in courtrooms or corner offices, but practiced every day by ordinary people, doing the hard, slow work of treating others as full and equal humans. Her legacy was never about the title she carried. It was in the way she walked into a room and left it changed. Naomi Ellis's story began with a quiet, calculated judgment made in a polished bank lobby, but what followed shook assumptions to their core. It wasn't just about a $250,000 check or a cold exchange between a black woman and a skeptical bank CEO. It was about the deeper, more dangerous truth: how easily power can dismiss those who don't look the part. Naomi wasn't loud. She didn't shout to be seen. She walked with dignity into a space that doubted her worth, and walked out having redefined it for everyone watching. When the CEO, Blake Whitmore, called the FBI to investigate Naomi under the veil of protocol, he expected validation. What he got instead was a lesson. The agents who arrived didn't detain Naomi, they saluted her. Because Naomi Ellis wasn't just another account holder. She was deputy director of a federal ethics division, an expert in dismantling exactly the kind of institutional bias she had just been subjected to. In that moment, the illusion-shattered assumptions don't stand a chance against truth. But the most powerful part of this story isn't the reveal, it's what came after. Naomi could have used her influence for revenge. Instead, she used it to reform, from launching a national equity initiative within the banking system to creating youth mentorships that brought marginalized voices into rooms they'd once been shut out of. She transformed pain into purpose. Her approach wasn't just restorative, it was visionary. The legacy she left behind through the Ellis Equity Standard, the Open Doors Fellowship, and internal policy reforms reminds us that the fight against prejudice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it stands still, lets silence speak, and forces others to reckon with their own reflection. Naomi didn't ask to be a symbol, but by choosing integrity over ego, accountability over outrage, and systemic change over temporary wins, she became one. So what can we, the audience, take from Naomi's journey? First, never underestimate the quiet strength of someone who knows who they are. Second, assumptions, especially when made from a place of bias, have consequences that reach far beyond a single moment. And third, when given the opportunity to react with anger, choose action. That's how systems are rebuilt from the inside out. In our daily lives, this means checking our biases, listening more carefully, and refusing to be complicit in small injustices that lead to larger ones. Whether we're leaders or learners, our responses shape the culture around us. If Naomi's story moved you, inspired you, or even made you uncomfortable in the right way, don't let it stop here. Subscribe to our channel to support more powerful real-life stories like this. Your voice helps us grow this community and shine a light on narratives that deserve to be heard. Let's keep the conversation going, and let's build something better together.